She stood at the edge of the road as the sky slowly turned pale. The night had been long and cold, and her body felt tired in a deep way. That sleep alone could not fix. She had a small bag with a few clothes and nothing else. Every step she took felt heavy, not just from the weight of the bag, but from the fear of not knowing where she would rest when the sun went down again. She had not planned to end up here. Life had shifted little by little, like sand sliding under water. First the job ended, then the room she rented was taken back by the owner, then the people she trusted stopped answering calls. She told herself it was only for a short time, but days turned into weeks and hope began to thin. The town was quiet in the early morning. A few lights glowed behind windows, but none felt like an option. She did not want pity, and she did not want trouble. She wanted safety and silence, a place where she could close her eyes without fear. She had heard about the old place on the hill. From someone at a food line, a man lived there alone. The place was not grand and not new, but it was dry and solid. People said he kept to himself and did not ask many questions. Some said he was strange, others said he was just tired of people. First, she dismissed the idea. Asking a stranger for shelter felt risky, but as the cold pressed deeper into her bones, the idea returned again and again. She told herself she would only ask for one night. Nothing more. The walk up the hill was slow. The road twisted through trees that had lost their leaves. The house came into view at last. It was small and worn, but it stood firm, like it had faced many storms and learned how to wait them out. She stood there for a long moment before knocking. Her hand shook slightly. She took a breath and reminded herself that walking away would leave her with nothing. The door opened after a pause. A man stood there, tall and still. His face was calm but guarded. He looked older than her, though not by much. His eyes studied her without judgment but without warmth. Either she spoke carefully, explaining that she had nowhere to go. She said she was willing to help around the place in exchange for a roof. Just a small deal, she said, simple and fair. He listened. Without interrupting, the silence stretched long enough to make her wonder if she had already been refused. Finally, he stepped aside and opened the door wider. He said she could stay for now. He said there were rules. She would have her own space, would help with daily tasks, and there would be no questions about the past. She agreed quickly. Relief washed over her, so strong it nearly made her weak. She stepped inside, holding her bag close, like it was the last proof of who she was. The inside of the house was clean but bare. The air smelled of wood and old air. There were signs of careful order, but also long loneliness. A chair by the window, a table with only one place set. He showed her a small room at the back. It had a bed and a blanket, and little else. To her it felt like more than enough that night. She lay awake listening to the sounds of the house, the creak of wood, the wind outside. She thought about how strange life was. One simple knock had changed everything. Morning came quietly. She rose early, not wanting to cause trouble. She cleaned the kitchen and swept the floor before he woke. She wanted to show she meant what she said when he entered the room. Later he noticed the work. He nodded once, nothing more, but something in his eyes shifted just a little. Days passed. In a steady rhythm, she helped with chores, cooking, cleaning, knitting to small repairs around the house. The work gave her purpose and kept her thoughts from drifting too far. They spoke little at first, only what was needed, but in silence they learned things about each other. She noticed he always left a chair empty at the table. He noticed she flinched at loud sounds. Neither asked why. At night she would sit by the window and watch the hill lights below. The town looked distant, like another life. She wondered how long this calm would last. He spent his days working around the property, fixing fences, carrying wood. He moved with the care of someone used to being alone. Sometimes their paths crossed, and there would be a pause, a shared glance, a moment where words almost formed but stayed behind closed lips. The deal remained clear: shelter for help, nothing more. Yet the house felt different now, not full, but no longer empty. One evening the power went out. A storm rolled in fast. The wind shook the walls and rain beat hard against the roof. She felt fear rise sharp and sudden. Memories she had tried to bury pushed forward. Her hands trembled as she stood frozen in the dark. He noticed at once. Without touching, he spoke calmly, telling her she was safe. He lit a lamp and placed it nearby. The simple act grounded her. She thanked him softly, her voice barely above a breath. He nodded and returned to his chair. But this time he stayed in the same room, as The storm passed, something unspoken settled between them. Trust, small and fragile but real. She realized then that this place was more than shelter. It was a pause from running, a chance to breathe. He realized too, though he would not admit it, that the quiet had changed. The house no longer echoed. In the same way, they went to sleep under the same roof, bound by a simple deal, unaware that it was already becoming something else. Neither of them knew that this was only the beginning of a bond that would reshape both their lives. Days turned into weeks, and the rhythm of the house settled into a quiet flow. She woke with the sun and moved through the rooms, carrying out the tasks that kept the house alive, sweeping dust from the corners, cooking meals from the small pantry, keeping the wood stove filled so the rooms stayed warm. He watched sometimes from across the room or through the window as she worked. She noticed the way he moved around the yard, fixing broken fences, gathering firewood. With care in every motion, they shared the space without words, but in that silence there was a new kind of understanding. Woman began to notice things about him that told stories without speaking. His hands were strong and scarred, as if they had done hard work for many years. His eyes sometimes softened when he looked at the small birds that landed near the windowsill, or when a stray cat approached the porch. One afternoon she found a notebook left on a small table. She opened it carefully. Inside were sketches and lists. Some were repairs he needed to make, others were drawings of the trees and hills around the property. There were notes about the seasons and weather. The notebook told her he planned ahead and cared for the world in his own way. She placed it back where she found it, feeling a connection she could not name. The quiet life around the house gave her time to remember herself again. Her own thoughts no longer rushed. She began to imagine the future beyond each sunrise. They began to talk in small moments, simple conversations about what needed to be done, or about the weather or the animals outside. Nothing deep at first, yet over cups of tea and warm meals their voices lingered longer than before. There was a rhythm to speaking and listening that felt safe. She noticed how he paid attention to details. She spilled a small cup of tea on the table one morning, and he calmly wiped it without anger. She realized he treated mistakes as part of life, not as failure. She started to feel the same way about herself. One evening, she asked about a scar on his arm. He looked away for a moment and then spoke in a quiet tone, saying it had been a long time ago, that was all. She did not press further, and he did not offer more. Yet she felt a piece of his story had been shared. The same time he noticed the way she flinched when loud sounds came from outside at night. He did not ask why. He simply stayed nearby and offered small gestures of reassurance, a hand on the shoulder or a blanket placed over her legs while silent. These actions spoke volumes. They shared meals together now more often. He no longer left a chair empty. She sometimes prepared extra and placed it on the table for him without a word. They ate quietly, but there was comfort in the routine. The house seemed to change too. The rooms felt warmer and lighter, even though the walls and floor were the same. The air carried the scent of fresh bread and herbs from the small kitchen. She realized that two people caring for the same space could make it more than a roof. One morning, she awoke to find he had left a small stack of firewood neatly beside her room. She smiled softly, realizing it was an unspoken way of caring. The gesture reminded her she was not invisible. Here she felt a small ember of trust growing inside. Weeks passed. The conversations grew longer. Sometimes they sat by the window and watched the hills at dusk. Without speaking, they shared thoughts about life and nature. In the simple rhythms of the day, the woman felt a quiet joy she had not known in a long time. She realized that help was no longer just about chores or survival. It was about connection. He started to share stories from his past in small fragments. A memory of a tree he climbed as a boy, a time he had helped a neighbor repair a roof. These stories were never offered as a way to impress or teach, just as pieces of himself left on the table like careful gifts. She listened and sometimes shared her own small memories from years ago. There was a day when a stray dog wandered onto the property. She had noticed it watching from the road for several days, but it had not come close. He noticed her hesitation and simply said it was safe. The dog came slowly and eventually lay down near the fire pit. They both watched it together without words forming. She felt that patience could be a language of its own. The woman began to notice how strong she had become. Even while living quietly, she moved with purpose and awareness around the house. She learned to trust the rhythm of her own breathing again, and to listen to the small needs of another human being. Without losing herself in the process, he began to notice subtle changes too. The careful glances and small kindnesses she offered made him feel something he had not felt in a long time. The weight of solitude lifted slightly. He realized the house was no longer only his space, it was shared, and he could feel a sense of relief in letting another life exist alongside his own. Some nights, they would hear the wind whistle around the eaves and rain patter on the roof. She no longer felt fear immediately. She knew someone was nearby. She felt a sense of safety she had not known in years. The fear of being alone had softened into quiet vigilance and gentle awareness. The woman began to care for herself in ways she had forgotten. She washed her hair and folded her clothes neatly. She read in the evenings. She wrote small notes about her thoughts, but kept them private. She learned to enjoy silence without the tension of hiding from the world. She realized the house allowed her to be human again. They shared the work in ways that felt natural. She learned to repair small fences and chop wood. She learned to make a fire that burned steadily and safely. She learned to prepare meals that were simple but nourishing. He noticed the care and skill she put into each task, and his respect for her grew. Their days passed in gentle cycles, sunrise to chores, to shared meals, to quiet evenings. She began to understand that the small things mattered most: the way the light fell through the window, the sound of the kettle boiling, the presence of another person without judgment. The rhythm of daily life became a foundation for healing. She noticed he never asked about her past, and she never asked about his wounds. The understanding between them was mutual. There was respect for privacy and space, but also a growing willingness to be present for each other without conditions. One afternoon, as she tended the garden, he joined her. He worked silently, but alongside her, the act of sharing labor created a rhythm they both appreciated. Each movement was mirrored in quiet companionship. The garden began to thrive as their bond quietly grew. At night, they sometimes lingered by the fire, each holding a cup of tea or simply sitting in silence. Their presence alone was enough. She felt a sense of belonging she had not known before. She realized that trust was forming in small gestures and unspoken agreements. The simple deal for shelter had become a shared life of small responsibilities and gentle kindnesses. Each day brought the possibility of something new, yet comforting. She no longer thought about leaving, except to wonder how long this quiet peace could last. The bond between them was fragile and unspoken, yet it was real. It existed in the way he noticed when she was tired, and in the way she offered care without being asked. It was a connection built slowly over weeks of shared space and effort and respect. She realized that living together had revealed strengths in both of them. The woman had resilience she had nearly forgotten. He had compassion that he had not allowed himself to show. They were learning from each other in ways that were subtle and profound. In the evenings, she sometimes listened to the night sounds outside the window, the wind in the trees, the rustle of small animals, the quiet hum of the world. She felt a sense of peace and safety. She had found a place that was not just a roof over her head, but a space where her life could slowly take shape again. He noticed to that the house felt different. The energy of shared life had softened its edges. The silence was no longer empty. It carried warmth and presence and the quiet promise of understanding without words. They had begun to create a home together without even realizing it. The simple deal for shelter had turned into something deeper. They were no longer two strangers sharing a roof. They were two people learning to live with care and patience and trust. The days continued in steady rhythm: work, conversation, silence, meals shared, and tasks completed. The bond was quiet but undeniable, and each day it grew a little more solid, a little more real. It was the start of a life changed by kindness, understanding, and human connection. One morning a letter arrived at the house. It was unusual for letters to come so far up the hill. She picked it up from the small wooden table near the door. She did not recognize the handwriting, but something about it made her hands tremble slightly. She held it carefully and wondered if she should open it or wait for him. She decided to open it herself. Slowly she unfolded the paper and read the words inside. They were not threatening or mean, but they carried weight. The letter reminded her of a life she had tried to Leave behind some old debts, some unresolved matters, some people she had avoided for years. She felt fear rise in her chest. Her heartbeat quickened. She did not know if she could face these problems now. She thought about leaving the house and moving again, but the thought of starting over without a place to rest made her stomach ache. He noticed her distress before she spoke. He did not ask questions at first. He simply sat near her and waited patiently for her to decide when to speak. She showed him the letter, and he read it quietly. His face stayed calm, but his eyes held understanding. She told him that the letter reminded her of old fears and mistakes. She was not proud of the past. She had tried to run from it, but it seemed the past had caught up anyway. He listened without judgment. He did not interrupt or offer advice. He simply offered his presence. The silence between them felt safe. She realized that sometimes just being there was enough to calm the storm inside. That evening, they spoke for the first time about their pasts in fragments. She told him small parts of her story. He told her parts of his own. They shared memories that were both painful and meaningful. Neither of them spoke of the whole truth, but they felt the weight lift slightly in sharing pieces. The next days were quiet but different. The letter had shifted something inside her. She felt both fear and relief. Fear of facing the past, relief that she no longer had to face it alone. She began to see that the simple deal for shelter had become more than survival. It was a place to process life again. Continued his daily tasks, but now sometimes paused to ask her how she was feeling. How was she holding up? How could he help? She began to notice that he cared. Not just about the work around the house, but about her emotional state. She realized this was a rare kind of kindness. She had rarely known one. Afternoon, she took the letter outside and read it under the tree in the yard. The sun warmed her back, and the breeze was soft. She reread the words, slowly letting herself absorb the reality of what had arrived in her life. She felt fear and anger, but also strength and a sense of determination. She returned to the house and shared with him what she decided. She would face the issues in the letter. She would take small steps one by one. She would not run. She would act carefully and with thought. He listened and nodded quietly. His presence gave her courage. She realized that trust had grown between them. It was not spoken yet. It was present in the way he allowed her to act freely while standing beside her. He did not control or pressure. He simply was there. Days turned into weeks again. The routine of chores, meals, and quiet conversation became the backdrop for her slowly addressing matters from the past. She wrote letters and replies she called old contacts. She met people for brief moments. She did not speak of everything to him, but she carried his support silently in her heart. The woman noticed the bond deepening. She realized that sharing tasks and shelter was one thing, but sharing strength and patience was another. She began to understand what it meant to allow another human to be near. Without fear, she could trust again in ways she had forgotten. He had noticed the changes in himself. He realized that having her in the house made the work lighter and the silence sweeter. He noticed that his own walls of solitude were softening. He could imagine a future where he was not entirely alone. One night, a small fire escaped the stove. She reacted quickly, but was unsure she could manage it alone. He noticed the smoke and came to help. They worked together, calmly and efficiently. No panic, just teamwork when the danger passed. They looked at each other without speaking, yet something unspoken passed between them. The woman realized she had been afraid to trust before. She had thought trust meant weakness. She learned now that trust could be strength and could be mutual. She felt safer with someone who was patient and present and who did not demand more than she could give him. Realized that he had been afraid to. He had believed that solitude was his only safety. He began to see that allowing another human presence did not mean loss, but rather a shared protection and warmth that strengthened both of them. Over time, the woman began to open more of her past in small ways. She spoke of memories from childhood. She spoke of struggles that had made her strong and wary. She told him stories not to seek pity but to be understood. He listened without judgment and sometimes shared stories of his own. There were moments of laughter, now small and careful. They found joy in simple things. A well-cooked meal, a bird landing on the windowsill, a cat curling near the fire. Their lives were quiet, but full of tiny sparks of connection. that illuminated. The day she began to recognize that her fear of abandonment was changing into confidence in the present. She felt rooted in a way she had not in years. The house had become a safe space. Not just physically, but emotionally. He observed that he no longer needed to retreat into himself after tasks were done. He lingered in the shared presence with her. He began to care for her small needs without being asked, and she began to notice and appreciate. These gestures, the bond grew in ways that were not dramatic, but steady and resilient. The woman felt strength in facing her past because she was not alone. She saw that her actions mattered and that she had someone who respected her choices. The man felt the quiet satisfaction of connection. Without losing his sense of self, the letter and its consequences were a turning point. They forced them both to acknowledge vulnerability and to act with care. The simple deal for shelter had become a test of patience, trust, and mutual respect. As the weeks turned into months, the house seemed to breathe with them. It was no longer a silent structure, but a living space of shared responsibility and care. They worked together in the yard, in the kitchen, in the small repairs around the house. Each task carried the unspoken promise that they were there for each other. They did not speak often of what the future might hold. But each day they learned to be present in the moment. Their bond was no longer about the deal for shelter. It was about life slowly unfolding together in shared understanding and support. One day they found an old photo tucked behind a loose floorboard. Showed a family long gone and a life that had been different for him. He showed it to her quietly, and she felt the weight of history pressing lightly against the walls. She understood then that everyone carried memories and scars, and that sharing them was a choice, not an obligation. She realized that her own story was still unfolding. She was no longer running, she was no longer hiding. She could face challenges and do it with someone beside her, even without words or grand gestures. The trust they had built allowed her to be human fully again. He realized that his life had changed too. He had begun to see the value of small kindnesses, of patience, of silent support. The house had become a place of learning for both of them, not just of chores and shelter, but of how to live with presence and care. The letter was no longer a symbol of fear, but a symbol of courage. It forced action. It reminded her of strength. It reminded him that trust could exist even after years of solitude. They both learned that life was more than survival and more than work. It was about connection, shared strength, and the quiet presence of another human being. The woman and the man continued their days in rhythm. They worked, they ate, they rested, and they supported each other in unspoken ways. They faced the past and began to see the future, each moment small but significant, each day reinforcing a bond that had started with a simple deal for shelter and was now turning into something life-changing and profound. The days grew longer, and the rhythm of life in the house became more natural. They woke with the sun and moved through the tasks that kept the house alive. They tended the garden, swept the floors, prepared meals, and chopped wood. The work was steady, but it was no longer only about survival. It was about care. In present, she noticed how her own confidence was growing. She could face tasks she would once have avoided. She could speak without fear and act with purpose. Her body and mind felt stronger and clearer. She realized that living in quiet with someone who respected her space allowed her to reclaim parts of herself she had thought lost. He did notice changes. He felt lighter in ways he had not expected. The house no longer felt heavy with silence. He began to share small routines with her: a cup of tea in the morning, a brief conversation. At lunch, a walk to check the fences together. These small rituals became important markers of trust. One morning they found the well had run low. He realized it would take effort to fetch water from the spring a half-mile down the hill. They both decided to go together. The journey was quiet, but it carried a sense of partnership. They walked side by side, carrying buckets, and noticed the trees, the wind, and the distant sounds of the town below them. Woman realized in that moment how small actions could build bonds. She felt trust, not just in his presence, but in the shared work. The physical effort became a metaphor for the care and attention needed to nurture life together back. At the house, they poured the water into the cistern and watched. It filled. The sound of it was soothing and familiar. A sense of accomplishment and shared purpose wrapped around them like a warm blanket. Later that day, she began to tell him about small dreams she had once had, dreams she had kept hidden out of fear. They spoke quietly in the kitchen while preparing a simple meal. She realized she could speak aloud without feeling judged or weak. He listened without interruption or commentary, simply offering space for her to speak. He began to open up more as, well, he told her of places he had wanted to see, of ideas he had once carried in youth. He spoke cautiously, but there was a softness in his tone. She listened and realized that sharing did not mean giving away control. It meant allowing connection. To exist, they faced small crises together as well. A heavy storm came with sudden wind and rain. The roof leaked in places, and water pooled on the floor. They worked together to patch the gaps, to move belongings out of harm's way, and to keep the fire burning. The crisis passed and left them both tired but satisfied. They realized that working together made even hardships manageable. In the quiet that followed, they sat near the fire, each lost in thought but aware of the other. The bond between them deepened in ways neither spoke of directly. It was visible in gestures, a hand placed near a spilled cup, a blanket adjusted over shoulders, a shared glance in the kitchen. She noticed the subtle changes in her own heart. She no longer flinched at sudden noises or felt panic at the thought of solitude. She began to trust that connection could be steady and nurturing. She realized that she could depend on someone without losing herself. He noticed his own shifts. He no longer felt the compulsion to retreat into silence after work. He lingered in shared presence with her. He cared about her needs and small comforts and found joy in providing them. He understood that life was richer when shared. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, they sat on the porch watching the sky turn pink and gold. The air was soft and quiet. The birds returned to nests. The wind rustled the remaining leaves on the trees. They sat in comfortable silence, feeling the calm that comes from shared understanding. Realized that living together had taught her patience and the value of slow connection. She had learned to observe and appreciate small gestures and to allow another person to exist in the same space without tension or fear. He realized that he had learned to let go of rigid solitude and to accept the presence of someone else without anxiety. He began to see that care and kindness could be a source of strength for both of them. The house itself seemed to change. They repaired broken fences, painted the doors, scrubbed the floors, and planted flowers. The work was steady, but it carried joy and care. The space became warm and alive. The walls held not only wood and plaster, but presence and effort and attention from both of them. One day, a neighbor stopped by offering some vegetables. They accepted graciously and shared a meal later in the evening. The simple act reminded them that life was connected to the larger world. They were part of a community, even on the hill, and that realization strengthened their sense of belonging. The woman began to explore the hills around the property. She would walk in the early morning, noticing small animals, listening to the wind, and feeling the earth beneath her feet. She carried her notebook and wrote observations, small sketches, and reflections. She shared these occasionally with him, and he appreciated the attention to detail and thought. He began to teach her small skills he had learned over years from farming and repairs. He showed her how to mend fences properly, how to store firewood efficiently, and how to recognize the signs of weather changes. He shared knowledge without commanding. She accepted it with curiosity and effort. The sharing of skills became another layer of trust. Evenings were often spent quietly. She might read aloud a passage from a book or tell a story from childhood. He listened and sometimes added his own stories. They laughed quietly at shared memories or amusing thoughts. The moments were small but meaningful. They built connection not through drama but through ordinary life experience together. One night, a letter from her past arrived again. She hesitated before opening it, but this time she felt more prepared. She read it and knew she could act without panic. She shared her thoughts with him, and he supported her calmly, helping her plan small steps to address what needed attention. She felt empowered in a way she had never imagined. The simple deal for shelter had become a life of partnership. They were no longer strangers exchanging tasks. They were companions learning to live with care, patience, and understanding. They faced challenges together and celebrated small victories. Together, the woman noticed her own resilience strengthening. She could now face difficult situations with composure. She had learned that she was not alone, and that the presence of someone patient and kind could make the world less daunting, he noticed. That he no longer feared connection, he had learned to give and receive care without losing independence. The bond was quiet but strong, built on shared experience and mutual respect. Days continued in rhythm: sunrise, chores, meals, conversations. Moments of silence, shared work, and quiet evenings by the fire, each moment reinforced their connection. Each day demonstrated that life could be better when lived together in trust and care. The woman and the man began to understand that the simple deal for shelter had become a turning point in both their lives. They were learning not only to live, but to live with connection, patience, understanding, and mutual support. They had come to realize that the bond between them was not dramatic or forced. It was natural, steady, and growing. It existed in the small gestures, in the shared work, in the quiet presence, and the understanding that they were not alone. She realized that she was building a new life. She could face challenges, act with care, and trust in the strength of partnership. She had found home not only in the house, but in the quiet bond that had grown between them. He realized that his life had changed as well. He had learned to trust the presence of another human being he had discovered. That care, patience, and quiet companionship could bring meaning and warmth into a life once spent in solitude. The bond continued to grow without words demanding it. It was present in tasks completed together and meals shared in quiet moments by the fire. It was simple but profound. It had begun with a deal for shelter, and was now a partnership that carried promise and life. Days continued with steady rhythm. The woman and the man moved through their routines together, yet now with a new awareness. Each task carried the weight of connection. Each shared meal, the warmth of understanding. Each quiet evening, the comfort of trust. She noticed how her life had changed in ways she had not expected. She had started with fear and exhaustion, yet now she woke with purpose. She moved through the house and yard with confidence. She prepared meals with care and watched the fire burn steadily. She tended the garden with patience and attention. Each action made her feel alive in ways that had been missing for years. He noticed changes in himself as well. He felt the walls of solitude he had built around himself softening. He no longer retreated after chores. He lingered in shared spaces, offering help and presence without demand. The quiet bond they had formed allowed him to experience connection without fear. They had faced challenges together, some from the past that surfaced unexpectedly, some from nature storms, leaks, and heavy rains. Each obstacle had been met calmly and with teamwork. They had learned to rely on each other, not out of obligation, but out of choice. The woman remembered the letters from her past. She had feared them before, but now she faced them with clarity and determination. She planned each step carefully and acted with thought. She no longer felt panic. She felt strength and courage, supported by the quiet presence of someone she trusted. Jay observed her resilience with quiet admiration. He had seen her fears and her moments of hesitation, and now saw her acting with resolve. He realized that trust had built not only safety but strength in both their lives. One morning they walked to the spring together, carrying buckets of water. They spoke little, but shared smiles and glances that said more than words could convey. They noticed the sounds of birds, the rustle of trees, and the distant hum of the town below. The journey became a ritual that reminded them that life was shared and that each day could hold quiet joy. Back at the house, they poured the water into the cistern and watched it fill. The simple sound of flowing water seemed to echo the quiet progress of their lives. The house itself felt alive, as if it had absorbed their presence and care. They repaired fences, planted flowers, and painted doors together. They transformed the space from mere shelter into a home. Each effort carried intention and love, not always spoken but felt deeply in the rhythms of life. The woman spent mornings observing the hills and fields around the house. She wrote small notes, sketches, and reflections in her notebook. She shared these occasionally, and he noticed the attention to detail, the thoughtfulness, the way she paused to appreciate the world around her. He began to teach her small skills. From years of experience, gardening, repairs, caring for animals, each lesson was shared gently and received eagerly. They built trust through shared effort and patience. The work itself became a way to communicate care and understanding. Evenings were quiet and meaningful. They shared meals and stories, sometimes laughed quietly at small things.
Oh, yeah.
Sometimes they simply sat by the fire, feeling the warmth and presence of each other. The bond had become natural, steady, and nurturing. She realized that the simple deal for shelter had become a profound connection. It had started with necessity, but had grown into trust, strength, and shared life. She could face challenges knowing she had support. She could act freely, and with confidence she had found a place to rest, a space to grow, and someone to walk beside her. He realized, too, that the bond had transformed his life. He had learned to give and receive care without losing independence. He had discovered the value of patience, kindness, and silent companionship. The presence of another human being brought warmth and purpose to his days. The seasons changed slowly around the house. They watched leaves fall and flowers bloom. They listened to rain and wind. They observed the sun rising and setting. Over the hills each day became a quiet celebration of life. In connection, one afternoon a small bird landed on the porch. It stayed long enough for them both to notice and smile. They observed it together, a shared moment of simple beauty. They realized that life could hold wonder even in quiet and ordinary spaces. They began to understand that connection was not about grand gestures or dramatic events. It was about presence, patience, care, and small acts of kindness. It was built in the rhythms of shared life and understanding, in watching for each other, and in offering support. Without question, she found courage in his quiet patience. She found joy in shared tasks. She learned to trust not only him but herself. She discovered that her own strength could grow when nurtured by gentle companionship. He found comfort in her steady presence. He found meaning in shared effort. He realized that life could be full and warm when someone else was beside him without expectation. The bond had become essential. To his sense of self and belonging, the house had become more than shelter. It was a space of growth and healing. It carried traces of their presence, care, and attention. Every corner held memory and effort. Every room reflected small acts of kindness. And work shared together, they continued their work with attention to detail. They repaired the roof, tended the garden, cared for animals, and kept the house clean. Each action was simple but significant. Each day built the trust and connection that had begun with a simple deal one night. As the sky darkened and stars appeared, they sat on the porch. Watching the vast expanse together, they felt the quiet of the world around them and the presence of each other. They spoke little but felt everything. They realized that life could be full and rich without words. That connection was more than talk. It was presence and understanding. Woman realized she had found home, not just in the house, but in the bond they had created. She felt safe and strong. She could face challenges knowing she had support and understanding. She had learned patience, care, and the quiet joy of living with another human being. He realized he had found companionship not as a burden, but as a gift he had learned to offer. Support without controlling, to receive care without fear. He felt life had opened in a new way, allowing warmth, joy, and connection he had not known before. The bond between them continued to grow steadily. The simple deal for shelter had evolved into a life-changing partnership. They faced challenges together, celebrated small victories, and experienced life fully in the quiet rhythms of shared days. They knew the bond was strong not because of dramatic events, but because of the steady presence, patience, and care that had grown over time. They understood that life could be meaningful without grand gestures, simply by existing together. With respect and attention, the woman and the man continued to move through life together, each day building on the last, each act of care reinforcing connection. They had learned to trust, to support, and to grow together. The house had become a true home, a reflection of the bond that had started with a simple deal and had transformed into a profound life changing relationship. The story of their lives was no longer about survival or fear. It was about trust, care, patience, and the power of human connection. They had created a life that was steady, warm, and full. They had discovered that sometimes the simplest beginnings could lead to the deepest bonds. The seasons continued to move slowly around the house. The hills shifted in color and texture. The sun rose and set over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. The woman and the man moved with the days, learning more about life. Together, with each passing moment, she Notice how comfortable she had become with the quiet rhythm of the house. The morning light falling through the windows felt like a promise. She prepared meals with thought and care. She tended the garden with patience. She chopped wood for the stove and stacked it neatly, each log in place. She had learned that small acts, done well, created a sense of peace and order that spread through the house and into the heart. He observed her quietly, noticing how her confidence and presence had grown. She no longer moved with hesitation or fear. Her hands were steady, her eyes alert. Her smile came naturally now and reached deeper into her eyes than before. He realized that she had found strength not only in herself but also in the support of their shared life. They spent long hours together, repairing the house, fixing fences, and tending the garden. Each task was an opportunity to work side by side. They spoke little during work, but shared glances and small gestures that conveyed care and understanding. The physical work became a language of its own. One morning, they walked down to the spring together, carrying heavy buckets of water. They moved slowly up the hill, noticing the wind in the trees, the scent of damp earth, and the soft sound of birds returning to their nests. They felt the comfort of companionship and shared effort. Each step built a sense of trust and connection that was quiet but strong. Back at the house, they poured the water into the cistern and watched it fill. They exchanged small smiles, knowing the simple act meant more than it seemed. The house seemed to breathe with them, and the sense of home felt deeper and stronger than before. She began to spend mornings writing and sketching in her notebook. She captured the hills, the trees, the animals, and the light. She shared these drawings with him sometimes, and he looked at them with quiet appreciation. They spoke without words through the images and observations. She realized that expression could be gentle and shared without needing validation. He began to teach her more skills, quietly showing her how to recognize signs of weather, how to maintain tools, and how to observe nature with patience and attention. Each lesson was given without pressure, and each was received with care. They built trust through learning together, not by speaking but by doing and observing. Evenings were often spent by the fire. They shared small stories from their days. The woman told of observations and ideas from her notebook. The man told of memories from work he had done long ago. They laughed quietly at small missteps and found joy in small moments of discovery. Each evening reinforced the bond between them. One afternoon, a stray dog appeared near the edge of the property. She noticed it watching from afar and waited to see if it would approach. The man quietly suggested leaving food out. The dog eventually came closer and lay near the fire pit. They observed it together. Without needing to speak, it became another small presence that added life to the home. The woman realized that living together had taught her patience and awareness. She could notice small changes in behavior in the wind, in animals, and in human presence. She could act thoughtfully and with care. Her life had become intentional and mindful. He noticed his own transformation. He had learned that solitude was not the only path to peace. He could offer care without losing independence and accept presence without fear. He felt his life had gained meaning through shared experience and support. House itself became a reflection of their life together. They repaired walls, painted doors, planted flowers, and cared for the garden they maintained. The wood stove and tended the animals. Each effort added warmth and comfort to the space, making it a true home rather than simply a shelter. She began to face old fears and unfinished matters from the past. She acted deliberately, writing letters, making calls, and meeting people when needed. She did not feel panic or overwhelmed. She acted with calm and confidence, knowing she had someone she could rely on for support. He watched her handle challenges with care and patience. He realized that she had become resilient and empowered. She no longer feared the past because she had learned to face it with thought and support. The bond between them had become a source of strength for both of them. They faced storms together. Heavy rains, wind, and lightning challenged the house in their efforts. They moved furniture, covered windows, and checked the animals. The shared work made each obstacle manageable, and their calm approach reinforced their connection. They learned that working together could make even difficult moments safe, and meaningful nights were often quiet. They sat by the fire, observing the flames and listening to the night sounds outside. The wind in the trees, the movement of animals, and the distant hum of the town became Part of their shared rhythm, they felt the quiet strength of presence and companionship. Without needing words, the woman began to understand that her life had changed completely. She no longer feared solitude or uncertainty. She had found a place of safety and connection. She had learned to live with trust, care, and patience. She could act freely, knowing she had support and understanding in the house and in the presence of the man he realized that his life had transformed as well. He had discovered the value of companionship, kindness, and patience. He could offer support without losing autonomy. He had learned that connection could strengthen and enrich life rather than complicate it. The seasons shifted again, the leaves fell, and the snow arrived. They prepared for the cold together, gathering firewood, tending the stove, and checking the animals. They adapted to the changes with care and collaboration. Each act of preparation was a shared effort, reinforcing the bond between them. They began to celebrate small moments together, the first flowers in spring, a meal that turned out perfectly, a small animal finding its way to the porch. They appreciated the ordinary as extraordinary because it was shared and observed. Together they discovered joy in the simplicity of life. The woman wrote in her notebook more frequently, capturing observations, reflections, and sketches. She occasionally read aloud her words, and he listened attentively. The sharing became a quiet ritual of trust. They discovered that communication could be gentle and unforced and still convey understanding and presency. Began to open up more about his past, sharing small memories and experiences. He spoke cautiously, but the stories carried weight and insight. She listened without judgment, offering presence and attention. Her responses were gentle and affirming. They found that mutual respect and understanding strengthened connection without forcing intimacy. Bond grew through shared experience and unspoken support. They completed tasks together, ate together, rested together, and celebrated quiet moments together. Each day reinforced that the simple deal for shelter had evolved into a profound, life-changing bond built on trust, care, patience, and human connection. She realized she had found a home not just in the physical house, but in the relationship. They had built a life where fear and isolation had been replaced by trust and companionship. She could face challenges knowing she was not alone. She could act freely with confidence and care. He realized that his life had changed in the deepest ways. He had learned to value connection, kindness, patience, and the quiet power of being present for another human being. He could offer support without expectation and receive care without fear. The bond was now central to his life and sense of belonging. They continued to live in rhythm with the days. Tasks were completed, chores shared, meals tended, gardens, repaired fences, and maintained the house. Each act was simple but meaningful. Each moment added to the strength of their connection. They observed the world around them, the changes of nature, the movements of animals, the patterns of weather, and the passage of seasons. They noticed the beauty and subtlety of life and shared it together. The small rituals became markers of trust and companionship. Evenings were spent in quiet reflection and togetherness. They watched the stars and felt the peace of shared presence. They spoke when necessary and were silent when words were not needed. They had learned to communicate through action, presence, and shared attention. She discovered joy in the quiet rhythms of life and the bond they had created. She could live fully in the present with confidence and trust. She could act thoughtfully, and with care she had transformed fear into resilience and uncertainty into stability. He discovered peace and purpose in the quiet companionship. They had created a life that was meaningful not through drama or spectacle, but through shared presence, effort, and understanding. He had learned that connection could enrich life and provide strength and warmth. The house and the bond between them had become inseparable. They were reflections of each other, and their shared life, the simple deal for shelter, had evolved into a life-changing experience built on trust, patience, care, and quiet human connection. They had discovered that small gestures, consistency, and presence could transform ordinary life into something extraordinary.